Welcome to Midnight Affairs, where secrets unravel, desires ignite, and bold stories keep you on the edge. Tonight begins Chapter 1, our very first story where passion meets betrayal in the most gripping way. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next thrilling chapter. The sun had barely set, casting long shadows across the quiet house. In the dim light, a car slowed to a stop in front of the driveway. A man stepped out, his face hidden in the shadows. He walked up to the door, knocking softly, almost nervously. Inside, the sound of footsteps echoed. The door creaked open. "Is it done?" The woman's voice was shaky, but there was something cold behind her words. The man nodded. "It's all set. They'll never see it coming." A chill ran down her spine. For years they had planned this moment. For years, it had seemed like a distant dream, a fantasy. But now it was real. They were about to take what was most precious to her husband. His kids. Their children. As the door shut behind him, a sickening feeling settled in her stomach. What they were about to do would change everything. And she could already feel the weight of their actions closing in, like a trap being set tighter with each passing second. Behind closed doors, their lives were anything but ordinary. John was an average guy, living a quiet, peaceful life with his wife, Emily, and their 2 kids. He worked long hours as a mechanic, doing his best to provide for his family. He wasn't perfect. No one was. But he loved his family and he thought they were happy. Little did he know, his whole world was about to be torn apart by the person he trusted the most. Emily, on the surface, was the loving wife. She cooked, cleaned, and always made sure the kids had what they needed. She was the kind of woman people admired, quiet, graceful, and seemingly kind-hearted. But behind those perfect smiles, Emily had her own demons. She had always felt like something was missing in her life. She had dreams, ambitions, and desires that went beyond the small town where they lived. She wanted more, and when things started to feel stale at home, she found herself in the arms of another man. It had started innocently enough. A few flirty messages here and there. But over time it grew into something bigger. Something that, at first, felt exciting, new and fresh. She had met Mark at a local cafe. He was charming, successful, and, most importantly, listened to her. He saw her in a way John never had. And for the first time in years, Emily felt seen. Mark was everything John wasn't. He was smooth, confident, and seemed to have everything figured out. But underneath that polished exterior, Mark had his own problems. He wasn't the perfect man he appeared to be. He had a past full of bad decisions, and his intentions with Emily were far from innocent. He wasn't interested in anything long-term, just the thrill of the chase. When he learned that Emily's husband was a hard-working mechanic who was hardly ever home, it only made things easier. He could have her and no one would suspect a thing. Emily and Mark's affair had been going on for months, and at first they thought they were getting away with it. But soon they started talking about something darker. Something that would change everything for John. They started talking about the kids. Emily had always known how much John loved them, and how far he would go to protect them. And as time passed, she became more and more convinced that she deserved a better life, a life with Mark. They started planning. Slowly, secretly. At first it was just talk. What if we could take the kids? What if we could raise them together? Emily would say, her voice trembling with both fear and excitement. Mark, of course, was all in. He didn't care about John. He saw this as a way to get what he wanted without any consequences. John had no idea about the secret plans being made behind his back. He was still working, still trying to provide. He came home every night to the same routine, dinner, small talk, and then the kids' bedtime stories. He noticed Emily had started to pull away, but he chalked it up to stress or maybe the pressure of parenting. He never suspected that the woman he loved was plotting to take everything from him. Emily's motivations were complicated. She wanted out of her life, but she didn't know how to get there. She loved her children, but part of her resented the life she had given up to raise them. She felt trapped, stuck in a marriage that didn't fulfill her anymore. And so, she chose the easy way out, running into the arms of another man and hoping he could give her the life she always wanted. For Mark, this was just a game. He saw it as a way to get what he wanted without thinking about the long-term consequences. He didn't care about Emily's kids. He didn't care about John. All he cared about was winning. And he thought he could get away with it. The affair and the planning grew darker as they got more comfortable with the idea. Emily started to look at her children in a different way, not just as the little people she loved but as obstacles in her path to freedom. She began to think that if she could take them from John, she could start over. She could have the life she always dreamed of with Mark by her side. John, however, was oblivious to all of this. He came home late one night after a long day at the shop, tired and ready to see his kids. He didn't know that Emily was sitting in the living room, deep in conversation with Mark. He didn't know that they had already set the plan in motion. The tension was building, but John couldn't see it. He was too focused on his work, on his love for his kids, and on the belief that everything was fine. He never imagined that his wife would betray him. He never imagined that the life he had worked so hard to build would crumble before his eyes. But the truth was, Emily and Mark's plan was already in motion. They were determined to steal John's children away, to break his heart and take everything he had. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were willing to go to any lengths to make it happen. As John slept that night, unaware of the storm brewing around him, the wheels were already in motion. His world was about to be turned upside down, and he would have to fight for everything he had. What he didn't know yet was that his revenge would come when he least expected it, and it would change everything. What seemed thrilling in the moment was quickly spiraling out of control. Emily and Mark had crossed a line they could never uncross. What started as a secret affair, a little escape from the monotony of their lives, had turned into something far darker. Their whispered conversations, once filled with nervous excitement, now echoed with a sense of inevitability. They were too deep in it now. There was no turning back. Emily had always dreamed of a life beyond the small town, beyond the limits of her marriage to John. Her frustrations had built up over the years, her desires left unspoken, buried beneath the responsibilities of motherhood and wifehood. But now, with Mark by her side, she felt like she could finally break free. The affair, at first just an act of rebellion, had grown into something far more dangerous. A shared dream of a life without John. A life where they didn't just have the freedom to be together, but could erase everything John had built. But the plan to take the kids was a dangerous gamble. Emily knew it. Mark knew it. They both had their doubts, but they convinced themselves it was the only way. Emily's heart wavered, torn between the love for her children and the hunger for a new life with Mark. She had always been a good mother. But in her mind, she wasn't just a mother. She was a woman who had sacrificed too much. And she felt entitled to the life she had always dreamed of, even if it meant betraying the man she had once vowed to love. Mark, on the other hand, was fueled by something far more primal: greed and control. He had never cared about John, never truly cared for Emily's children. He saw them as obstacles, small hurdles in the way of his prize, Emily. And if he had to take them, lock them away, and manipulate the situation to get what he wanted, so be it. He was willing to play a dangerous game. After all, what was life without a little risk? The plan was simple, too simple. Emily would make it look like she had been the victim of a broken marriage, a wife who just couldn't take it anymore. Mark would step in as her hero, the one who would rescue her. And together they would raise the children, shaping them into their vision of the future. They could take them away from John, and with the right moves, no one would question it. No one would even suspect. John, meanwhile, continued to live his life in the dark. He trusted Emily completely, never thinking for a second that she could betray him. He was too focused on his work, on providing for the family he loved. He was too caught up in the routine of life to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. By the time he noticed, it would be too late. The plan began to take shape. Emily, ever the master of subtlety, started planting seeds in John's mind. Little things, an offhand comment about how she didn't feel appreciated, how the marriage had lost its spark. At first, John didn't take it seriously. He brushed it off, assuming it was just the normal stress that comes with parenting in life. But over time, Emily's words began to chip away at his confidence, and he found himself second-guessing everything. It wasn't just the emotional distance. It was the way she seemed so distant when they were together. The way she smiled less. The way she pulled away from him at night. John started to feel like he was losing her. But he couldn't understand why. What was happening? And most importantly, why didn't she talk to him about it? Mark, ever the opportunist, began showing up more frequently. It started with casual visits. He would stop by to check on Emily, but soon he was spending more time in their home, under the guise of helping with repairs or offering advice. John, too busy to notice anything strange, welcomed the help. Mark played the part of the concerned friend to perfection, always attentive, always kind. But behind the surface he was taking note of every weakness, every small crack in John's life. But there were risks. This wasn't going to be easy. Emily knew that. Mark knew it too. Taking the kids would be a delicate operation, and if anything went wrong they could both end up losing everything. Emily wasn't sure how far she was willing to go, but she couldn't turn back now. The temptation of a life with Mark, the freedom to live her dreams, was too strong. And Mark, well, he had no interest in stopping until he had what he wanted. As the weeks went by, Emily grew more and more obsessed with the idea. She would lie awake at night, imagining what her life would look like with Mark. They would get the kids, they would run away, and they would start over. The old life, the old problems would all be gone. She could leave behind the nagging voice in her head that told her she was a bad mother, that she was betraying her family. Mark's promises were enough to drown out that voice, to silence her doubts. But even as she fantasized about this new life, something started to eat away at her. Fear. Fear of being caught. Fear of losing everything. The perfect image of the future she'd built in her head began to crack. There was no way they would get away with this forever. What if John found out? What if someone started asking questions? What if it all fell apart? And then came the breaking point. One night, Emily overheard a conversation that Mark had with someone else. Someone who knew too much, someone who was too close to the situation. Emily froze as she listened to Mark's voice, filled with a sense of urgency, telling the other person that they couldn't afford to wait any longer. The plan was already set in motion and there was no turning back. The tension was unbearable. Emily, her heart pounding in her chest, stood frozen in the shadows. This was it. The moment everything would change. She had crossed the line. The plan to take the kids was no longer a simple dream, it was becoming a nightmare. John, however, remained unaware. He went to work, came home, and tried to keep things together. He had no idea that the life he had worked so hard to build was crumbling around him. He had no idea that his wife, the woman he trusted above all others, was orchestrating a plan that would destroy him. And as the days passed, the stakes grew higher. The risks became clearer. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything could unravel. But Emily and Mark, fueled by their desires and desperation, were ready to take that risk. What had seemed like a thrilling escape was now a dangerous game. The walls were closing in and soon the truth would come to light, whether they were ready for it or not. With every move the walls seemed to close in tighter. Emily's plan, once a distant dream, was beginning to feel like a sinking ship, one that was too far gone to salvage. Each passing day brought more risk, more uncertainty. What was once thrilling, a secret life built on whispered promises and stolen moments, had begun to feel like a dangerous game. A game they were losing. But Emily and Mark, neither willing to back down now, pressed forward. Mark's presence in their home had grown, and so had the subtle manipulations. At first he had appeared as nothing more than a concerned friend, helping with repairs, making sure Emily didn't feel alone. But Emily saw the way his hands lingered a little too long, the way his words carried more weight each time he spoke. He was becoming her crutch, the one thing she leaned on when the fear of being caught crept in. But even Mark had his own insecurities. Emily could see the way he looked over his shoulder, always making sure no one was watching. Mark wasn't just playing this for love, he was playing it for control. And as much as he had promised to keep their plan in motion, Emily began to question whether he had his own agenda, one that didn't include her. John, still blissfully unaware of the chaos brewing in the shadows, seemed to be growing more distant. Every time Emily dropped a subtle hint, mentioning how the spark had gone out in their marriage, John only grew more withdrawn. It was as if he couldn't see the growing cracks in their relationship, or worse, he didn't want to. The more Emily nudged him, the more he pulled away, leaving her feeling isolated and vulnerable. But it wasn't just the tension between Emily and John that was mounting. Outside forces, people who hadn't been part of their plan, were starting to take notice. A colleague of John's, someone who had known him for years, began to grow suspicious. Mike, a close friend of John's, had noticed the change in Emily. He saw the way she had become more distant, more secretive. But it wasn't just her behavior that caught his attention. It was the way she was suddenly so much more focused on her own well-being. Mike had always admired Emily. He had been friends with John long before the marriage, but he never thought he'd find himself questioning her motives. He hadn't seen the tension building between her and John, but the changes in Emily's behavior were becoming too obvious to ignore. One night, Mike called John to check in, But it was Emily who answered the phone, her voice colder than he remembered. She quickly brushed him off, citing her busy schedule. It was a small thing, but it planted a seed of doubt in Mike's mind. Was there something more going on? He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but there was something unsettling about the way things were shifting. And so, Mike decided to keep an eye on things, to watch from the outside, unaware that his suspicion would soon spiral into something far more dangerous. Meanwhile, Emily's feelings of fear began to grow. The perfect image she had painted in her head, of a life with Mark, free from John and the responsibilities of motherhood, was starting to fade. What if Mike, or worse, someone else, started to figure things out? What if they couldn't pull this off? The thought of Mark's betrayal hung over her like a storm cloud, but there was no room for doubt now. She had to follow through. But Mark's own fear was beginning to surface. Despite his bold words, his calculated moves, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were slipping away from him. The deeper they got into their plan, the more they became trapped. Each step forward felt like a step closer to exposure. The once carefree meetings with Emily now had a sense of urgency to them. The stakes had been raised. If they didn't act soon, everything would fall apart. Late one evening, Emily overheard another conversation that only added to the mounting tension. Mark, his voice low and filled with irritation, was speaking to a woman she didn't recognize. Emily listened, barely breathing, as Mark discussed the plan, how they would take the kids, how they would get away. But something in his tone was different this time. It wasn't just excitement or determination, it was fear. Fear that someone, maybe even John, was closing in on the truth. Her heart raced. The plan that had once seemed so simple, so straightforward, was now riddled with cracks. Emily felt like she was teetering on the edge of a cliff, and one wrong move would send her plummeting into disaster. Then a week later, John surprised her. He came home early, something he never did. He hadn't been acting right for days. There was a stiffness in his movements, a nervous energy in his eyes that made Emily's stomach churn. He said he wanted to talk. And as they sat down, his words caught her completely off guard. "I know something's wrong," he said quietly, his voice more serious than she had ever heard. "I don't know what it is, but I can feel it. You've been distant, Emily. We've both been distant, and I don't know how much longer I can ignore it." Emily's breath caught in her throat. This was the moment she had feared. The moment when everything could come crashing down. But she had to act. She couldn't let him catch on. So she put on a mask, forced herself to play the role of the helpless wife. "I've been under so much stress, John," she said, her voice soft and pleading. "I didn't know how to talk to you about it. I feel like we're growing apart, and I didn't want to admit it." John seemed to believe her, nodding slowly, his face softening with concern. But Emily knew deep down that this wasn't over. John was suspicious. And that suspicion would only grow, making it harder to keep up the act. And then there was Mark, his anxiety growing with each passing day. The more they lingered, the closer they came to exposure. If they didn't move quickly, everything they'd worked for would come crashing down around them. The risks were too great. And the truth, once it came to light, would destroy them both. The plan that had once felt like a secret escape was now an uncontrollable beast, its jaws closing around them with every lie, every manipulation. With every move, they were one step closer to losing everything. The tension was unbearable, and it was only a matter of time before everything would unravel. In one moment, everything they thought they knew was shattered. Emily had been preparing for a confrontation. She knew it was coming. But nothing could have prepared her for the harsh truth that dropped into her lap, unraveling everything she thought she controlled. It all started with a phone call that Emily didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm, and filled with cold, deliberate precision. It was Mike, the one man she had never expected to become involved in the chaos she had so carefully orchestrated. "I know what you're doing," Mike's voice rang through the phone, his words sharp and chilling. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she sat down, gripping the phone tighter than she ever had before. "What are you talking about?" she forced out, trying to maintain composure despite the fear gripping her throat. "Don't play dumb, Emily," Mike continued, his voice unwavering. "I know about Mark. I know about everything. I've been watching you. And I'm not going to stay quiet about it." Her mind raced, scrambling for a way to contain the damage. The revelation was a nightmare. She had been caught, exposed, and Mike's knowledge of her secret made it all feel like it was crumbling. She had never imagined that Mike, of all people, would turn on her. He had always been a trusted friend, someone she believed would never question her. But here he was, on the other end of the phone, threatening to destroy everything she and Mark had built. How did you find out? Emily's voice cracked with panic. Mike chuckled bitterly. It wasn't hard. You've been slipping up. Your behavior, your late nights, the way you've been avoiding John. It all adds up. Emily's breath hitched. She could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She knew this was bad, but she never expected it to be so public, so exposed. The fear of losing everything, the marriage, the life she had built, seemed closer than ever. I don't want to hurt John, Mike continued, his tone softening just a little. But I can't ignore what's going on here. If you don't come clean, if you don't put an end to this, I will. Emily's mind raced with options, but nothing felt like it could stop the inevitable. She had already crossed too many lines, burned too many bridges. There was no going back now. What do you want? She whispered, knowing that anything she said would come with a heavy cost. I want you to end this before it destroys everything. Before it destroys John, before it destroys you. Emily sat there, paralyzed by the weight of Mike's ultimatum. He was right in a sense. She had pushed things too far. But could she really stop now? Could she tell John everything? Could she end it all, give up on Mark, and salvage any part of her life? The seconds felt like hours as she weighed her options, and just when she thought she couldn't bear the pressure any longer, the door swung open. Mark stood there, his face etched with fear. He must have overheard the conversation, and in his eyes, Emily saw a reflection of her own terror. What's going on? Mark asked, his voice strained. Emily's words caught in her throat as she stared at him. The plan that had once felt so secure, so carefully built, now seemed like a house of cards, ready to fall with the slightest touch. Mark had been her partner in this mess, the one who had encouraged the deception and the betrayal. But now she wasn't sure he was the ally she had once thought him to be. Before she could answer, the phone beeped, signaling that Mike had hung up. Mark stepped closer, his eyes searching her face. Who was that? He demanded. What did they say? Emily took a deep breath, her mind racing for a lie, for something that could keep the truth buried just a little longer. But as she opened her mouth, she saw it in Mark's eyes, the same fear she felt. I don't know, she lied, her voice barely a whisper. It was just a prank call. But Mark didn't buy it. His expression darkened, and Emily saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Are you sure? Before she could respond, the doorbell rang and John's voice called out from the front door. The tension in the room thickened like a storm about to break. Emily? Mark? Can we talk? It was John, his presence both a comfort and a threat. As Emily and Mark exchanged a look, the reality of their situation hit them both. They were trapped, caught between the lives they had built and the chaos they had created. There was no more room for hiding. With a shaky breath, Emily moved toward the door. She had no choice now but to face the consequences. The revelation of her betrayal, of everything she had worked to keep hidden, was no longer a matter of when, it was a matter of how badly it would all fall apart. John stepped into the room, his face pale and drawn. He had been losing himself to his suspicions, his fears gnawing at him. Emily could see it in the way he looked at her, like he was already bracing for the worst. I need the truth, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I know something's been going on, Emily. I need to know what it is. The room fell silent. Emily could feel her heart racing, her throat closing. She had two choices now, admit everything or let the lies drag them all down further. Mark was standing behind her, but he didn't speak. The weight of the moment was on her shoulders alone. As she looked at John, she saw the man she had once loved, a man who had trusted her, a man who deserved better than the betrayal she had dealt him. The truth, no matter how painful, was the only way forward. I've been seeing someone, Emily said, her voice breaking as the words spilled out. I'm sorry, John. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. John's face twisted in shock, his eyes searching hers as if looking for any sign of doubt in her words. But there was none. This was the moment of reckoning, and everything she had feared had finally come to pass. Mark stood still, not a word escaping his lips. The truth had come out. The web of lies was undone, and the fallout would be more destructive than Emily had ever imagined. John stood motionless for a moment, taking in the full weight of what she had said. And then, with a single glance at Mark, he turned and walked out of the door, leaving behind only the broken pieces of their shattered lives. And in the silence that followed, Emily realized the true cost of the life she had tried to build. Not just the loss of John, not just the betrayal of trust, but the complete unraveling of everything she had worked so hard to protect. The cost of their choices was now impossible to ignore. Emily stood there, frozen in place as the sound of John's footsteps faded away, leaving nothing but the emptiness of their home. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Everything she had done, every decision, every moment of betrayal had led to this. There was no going back. She turned slowly to look at Mark, but he was already pacing, his face a mixture of frustration and fear. "What have we done?" he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her. Emily didn't know how to answer him. Her mind was clouded, her thoughts a jumble of guilt and regret. They had crossed a line they could never uncross, and the consequences were unfolding in real time. Mark stopped pacing, suddenly looking at her with intensity in his eyes. "What now?" he demanded. "What happens to us?" His question hung in the air, an accusation as much as a plea for direction. Emily wanted to scream, to tell him that it was over, that they couldn't keep playing this game. But her voice caught in her throat. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She felt as if everything was slipping through her fingers, just as it had with John. There was no certainty anymore, only the weight of their choices and the pain they had caused. A sudden knock on the door broke the silence, making Emily jump. She glanced at Mark, who was staring at the door, his face pale. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice shaky. The response came quickly, but it wasn't a voice either of them had expected. "It's Mike." The sound of Mike's name was like a punch to the gut. He had been the one to expose everything, to force her into the confrontation she had been avoiding. Emily's heart raced, knowing that the situation was about to escalate beyond her control. Mark hesitated, his gaze shifting between Emily and the door. "Should we let him in?" Emily didn't answer at first, but she could see the hesitation in Mark's eyes too. Mike was the last person they needed right now. He had been her ally once, a trusted friend, but that trust had evaporated the moment he threatened to expose everything. He wasn't just a witness to their downfall, he was now part of it. But as the knocking continued, persistent and urgent, Emily knew they couldn't avoid the confrontation any longer. She took a deep breath and walked toward the door. When she opened it, Mike stood on the other side, his face grim and unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past her without waiting for an invitation. "Mike, what's going on?" Emily asked, trying to keep the panic from her voice. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what he was about to say, but the silence hanging between them was unbearable. Mike didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder at Mark, who had followed Emily into the entryway, his body tense. "Mike, what are you doing here?" Mark asked, trying to mask the nervous edge in his voice. "This isn't your business anymore." Mike's eyes flickered with something. Anger? Disappointment? It was hard to tell, but his tone remained cool and collected. "You're wrong. It's my business now. You've both made it my business by getting involved in something you can't undo." Emily felt her stomach drop. She had been avoiding this moment, hoping the consequences wouldn't catch up with her, but now they were here, and they weren't going anywhere. "We need to fix this," Mike said firmly. "You two have dug yourselves into a hole, and now you're going to drag everyone else down with you. I'm not letting that happen." Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she exchanged a look with Mark. This was it. There would be no more secrets, no more manipulation. Mike had made it clear that he was willing to expose them if they didn't act quickly. "What do you want?" Mark demanded, his voice shaky. "If you're not going to keep quiet, then just say it. What's next?" Mike's gaze shifted to Emily, then back to Mark. "You'll have to come clean to John. And you need to do it soon. He deserves the truth. He deserves to hear it from you, not from me." The words hit Emily like a slap in the face. She had known this was coming, but hearing Mike say it aloud made it real. The truth had to come out, but the thought of facing John, of seeing the betrayal in his eyes, made her stomach turn. But it's too late," Emily said, her voice cracking. "He's already gone. He left. I can't fix this now." Mike's expression hardened. "Then you'll have to live with it. You'll have to live with the fallout of your actions, and trust me, it's going to get worse before it gets better." Mike's warning hit like a cold wave, washing over Emily and leaving her feeling numb. What had she done? What had they all done? She had thought she could control everything, but now everything was spiraling out of control. Before anyone could speak again, Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her hands trembling as she saw the name on the screen. John. He was calling. With a deep breath, she answered, knowing that nothing would ever be the same after this conversation. John? She said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Emily. John's voice was cold, almost distant. I don't know what to say to you right now. I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know if I want to anymore. Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she listened to the pain in his voice. She had caused it. She had destroyed the one good thing she had left, and now she had no idea how to make things right. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I never wanted to hurt you. But as John's voice softened, she realized there was no going back to the way things were. The damage had been done. The consequences were set in motion, and they would play out no matter how much she wished they wouldn't. I don't know if I can forgive you, John said quietly, his words hanging heavy between them. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. The phone call ended, and Emily stood there in stunned silence, the weight of her actions sinking in. The truth had shattered everything. Her marriage, her trust, and the life she had once known. And now the only thing left to do was face the consequences, no matter how painful they would be. As the truth emerged, there was no turning back. Emily had barely set down the phone when the doorbell rang again. This time it wasn't a soft knock or hesitant tap. It was insistent, demanding. Without a word, Mark moved toward the door, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. Are you expecting anyone else? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure if she wanted to know the answer. Mark shook his head slowly, fear rising in his chest. No. But I don't think we can hide from it any longer. The door creaked open, revealing a tall figure standing in the doorway. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the person standing there. It wasn't Mike as she had expected. It was John. John? Emily's voice faltered, her heart pounding in her chest. John's expression was unreadable, his jaw set tight. His eyes didn't soften when they landed on Emily. There was no warmth in them, just a coldness that cut through her like a blade. What do you want? Mark asked, his voice filled with both fear and defensiveness. He knew the truth was coming, but he wasn't ready for it to be laid bare just yet. I want answers, John said, his tone hard. I want to know why you two thought you could get away with this. With all of this. His words sliced through the room like a storm, and Emily took a step back, her hand gripping the doorframe for support. She had known this moment was coming, but nothing could prepare her for the reality of it. The confrontation was real. It was happening. I'm sorry, John, Emily said, her voice cracking as she fought to hold back tears. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't know how to fix it. John's gaze was cold, searching. Fix it? Emily, you've ruined everything. You don't just fix something like this. You've broken trust, our trust. My heart. You made a choice. And now you have to face the consequences. Mark stepped forward, his eyes flickering nervously between Emily and John. We both know this wasn't all Emily's fault. I didn't? You didn't what? John interrupted, his voice rising with anger. You didn't force her to do this? You didn't convince her to betray me? I know what happened. I know everything now. And don't try to play the victim, Mark. You're just as guilty. Emily's heart hammered in her chest, her stomach twisting into knots. She had no idea how they had ended up in this moment. A few weeks ago she had thought she could control everything. But now everything was falling apart. John's gaze never left her. I trusted you. I gave you everything. And this is how you repay me? His voice cracked with pain, the depth of his hurt impossible to ignore. I didn't know what I was doing, Emily whispered. The words felt hollow, a desperate attempt to explain away the unexplainable. Mark stepped between them, his eyes pleading with John. Please. We're not here to fight anymore. We just need to figure out what comes next. We have to work through this. John scoffed. Work through this. He laughed bitterly, but the sound was empty. There is no next. There's nothing to fix. The only thing left is how to make sure I never have to see either of you again. The room felt suffocating, as if every word, every movement, was pushing them closer to the edge of something irreversible. Emily's eyes darted to Mark, who stood silently, his shoulders sagging with defeat. It was over. They had failed. Suddenly, without warning, Emily's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, an unknown number. For a moment she hesitated, then answered it, her hands shaking. "Hello," she said softly. "Emily, it's Mike," came the familiar voice on the other end. "You need to get out of there. Now." Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "They're coming. The cops. I've already said enough to make sure they're on their way. You need to go before they get there. Before everything falls apart." "Mike, what are you talking about?" Emily asked, panic rising in her chest. "I did what I had to do." Mike's voice was cold and final. "The police are coming. You don't have much time." Her mind raced. The walls were closing in, and she could already hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, getting closer with every passing second. It wasn't just the emotional devastation anymore. Now the law was coming to take everything from her. "Emily," John's voice broke through her thoughts, his tone desperate. "What's going on? Who are you talking to?" Tears burned in Emily's eyes as she stood frozen, the weight of it all crashing down on her. Her mind raced, but the only thing she could focus on was the looming reality. Her life was about to unravel, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mike called. "The cops are on their way." Mark's eyes widened in shock. "What do we do? How do we fix this?" But it was too late for fixing anything. The moment had passed. The truth was out there. The fallout was inevitable. John stepped forward, his face a mask of anger and betrayal. "It's over. You've lost. This is the price you pay for your choices." And with those words, everything shattered. The life Emily had known, the relationship she thought could survive anything, gone in an instant. As the sirens grew louder, Emily knew there was no escape. The consequences of their actions had finally caught up to them, and there was no way out. The truth had emerged. There was no turning back. As the days passed, the weight of their decisions became almost unbearable. Emily sat quietly in her small apartment, staring out the window, watching the world go by. The once bustling city outside seemed so far removed from the life she had once known. Her thoughts kept replaying the moment everything had changed. The moment John had stood in front of her, his anger and betrayal clear in his eyes. The consequences of her choices, once just distant possibilities, had now become an unshakable reality. The trial had been swift. There was no denying the evidence, no escaping the truth. Emily, Mark, and Mike had all been implicated. John's testimony had sealed their fates, and the law had taken its course. The courtroom had felt suffocating, the weight of the room pressing down on her chest. She had hoped for some form of redemption, but there was none to be had. The damage was done. Mark had been sentenced to time in prison. Emily, too, faced a long road of consequences, her life forever altered by the mistakes she had made. Mike had disappeared after the trial, leaving only a trail of broken promises and empty words. But the emotional toll was what truly haunted Emily. The relationships that had once been the pillars of her life were now shattered beyond repair. Her bond with her children was strained, and the guilt she carried was heavy. She couldn't undo the damage. She couldn't take back the lies and betrayal. John, too, had suffered. The pain of betrayal had left deep scars, but he had found a way to move forward. It wasn't easy. It wasn't fast. But with time he started to heal. The trust he had once placed in Emily was gone, but he had rebuilt his life in a way that no longer revolved around her. He had learned that sometimes, the only way to heal was to leave the past behind and focus on the future. As for Emily, she knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. She had made choices that had cost her everything she held dear. But in the stillness of her quiet moments, she began to understand a hard truth. She had the power to shape what came next. It wouldn't be easy, but the future was still hers to define. The lesson was clear. Every choice, no matter how small, has a consequence. Trust, once broken, can never truly be repaired. The damage may fade with time, but the scars will always remain. As the final chapter of this tumultuous story came to a close, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of bitter finality. It was over and there was no going back. But life moved on, and so would she, one step at a time, trying to rebuild what had been lost. Thank you for reading. If this story left an impact on you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that explore the complexities of life, trust, and redemption. Stay tuned for the next one.